I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening to discuss some of the serious issues facing our nation, our record budget and job deficit. I'd like to thank the Norfolk City Council for hosting us this evening, and like to, I didn't notice any elected officials. Any elected officials here? I didn't see any.
Dr. Daniels from the school board.
Dr. Daniels from the school board. Thank you. Dr. Daniels, member of the school board enforcement. Any other elected officials? Well, also joining me in the discussion about the budget and fiscal policy and job creation is Michael Cassidy, the president and CEO of Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis. With the unemployment rate now stuck over 9%, the president has submitted a jobs proposal to Congress 2 weeks ago. And while I have concerns about some aspects of the plan, such as extension and further reduction of the payroll tax that may jeopardize Social Security, I believe the president is correct for calling for more immediate spending and infrastructure projects and funding for teachers and firefighters. As many are aware, last month the Congress passed and the president signed the budget agreement. It was called the debt ceiling agreement, but the debt ceiling had nothing to do with the budget. It was just used as a leverage over the budget. It's never been connected with the budget before, so some of us were disappointed that it was used this time as a leverage to pass to get their way on some budget issues. But it calls for cutting for more than $2 trillion from the federal budget over the next decade. This is a significant pullback in federal spending and may have a significant impact on jobs in our region, which is heavily dependent on defense and other federal spending. Many in this area are directly employed by the federal government at the Norfolk Naval Base, the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, Oceana, NASA, other military bases. Others are indirectly employed by the federal government. The local shipyards, Newport News shipyard, for example, has virtually all of its income and revenue from government sources. Many others benefit from the fact that many people have those government paychecks to spend in their businesses. We have the context of this deficit reduction. The context is the Bush-era tax cuts, which were extended last December. That was $400 billion a year. I've mentioned to people for 2 years, that's $800 billion. To give you an idea of how big $800 billion is, if you add up the aggregate general fund budget of 50 states, Virginia's general fund budget is about $17 billion a year. They spend more than that. Some are dedicated funds, some are federal funds, but the general fund budget is $17 billion. If you add up the aggregate general fund budget of 50 states, it's $650 billion. And so we did a 2-year tax cut at a total of $800 billion. You can't spend that kind of money in tax cuts without being cautious as to how you're going to pay for it. The future promise was to pay for it, and when we came back in January, it was apparent that we needed to get fiscally responsible. The number of people kept coming up with is $4 trillion over 10 years, which is, if you take $400 billion a year multiplied by 10, that's $4 trillion. And so when we start cutting, the cuts are necessitated by the tax cut extension. Now, one of the things people are not aware of is that we haven't cut anything yet other than student loans. Everything else, spending caps. We will find out in the next couple of weeks what actually gets cut as we appropriate under those caps. And that's when people will find out what the cuts are. In addition, we have created a joint select committee on deficit reduction, or called a super committee, consisting of 6 members of the House, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans from both the House and the Senate, 12 members, charged with proposing an additional $1.5 trillion. In addition, the President's jobs program, over $400 billion, needs to be paid for, and he has asked the super committee to come up with an additional $400 billion to pay for the jobs plan. In November, the Joint Select Committee will release its recommendations, and they have a procedure where they will have an up or down vote in both the House and the Senate on those recommendations before the end of the year. And we don't know exactly what's going to get cut. As I said, they're all spending caps. But we do have an idea because earlier this year, there was a continuing resolution with $66 billion worth of cuts in the middle of the fiscal year. If you extrapolate that out to a full year, there would be about $100 billion. If you extrapolate that over 10 years, that would be $1 trillion. These numbers are not exact, but in order of magnitude, we can see what $1 trillion spending cuts look like by looking at what got cut in that budget. And we saw cuts in safety net programs like low-income home energy assistance, community action agencies like STOP in Norfolk and Office of Human Affairs and Newport News, community health centers, women, infants, and children, WIC nutrition, and legal aid. They cut investments in our future like Head Start, NASA, health immunizations, job training, transportation investments such as high-speed rail, and it cut important functions of government like air traffic controllers, law enforcement grants, FBI, clean water grants, FEMA, border security, national parks, food inspections, poison control are just some of the programs that were cut in the first $1 trillion. The next $1.5 trillion will come from the Gang of 12 or the Super Committee, and we'll have to find out what they are. But sadly, even with these cuts, with all of these cuts, and it is everyone assumes that Medicare and Social Security will be part of these cuts. All of these cuts, as I said, are necessary only because of the tax cuts. If you add up $1 trillion now and $1.5 trillion with the Super Committee, that's $2.5 trillion. If the $400 billion a year tax cuts are extended, as it looks like they're going to get extended, that's $4 trillion. $2.5 trillion in cuts, we're still $1.5 trillion behind where we would have been if we had just stayed at home after the 2010 elections. So we have a lot of work to do because of those tax cuts. Now, one of the things that I have suggested to people is when they say that those spending cuts are necessary, I like them to use complete sentences. Cutting Medicare and Social Security are required to preserve the tax cuts from the that were extended in December. If you let the tax cuts expire, you have as much deficit reduction on the table as Simpson-Bowles or even the Republican House plan. You have as much deficit reduction as in any of those plans. Now, let me go through a few charts, the charts that we passed out to give a little idea of some of the details on a budget. And we see that the budget is comprised of Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security, income security, other income security programs, interest on the national debt, veterans and other services. Then you have defense and non-defense, the so-called discretionary part of the budget. That's the part that we argue about every year. Everything else is on pretty much automatic pilot. The non-defense discretionary is 16% of the budget. So when they start talking about cutting, if you only cut non-defense discretionary, you're not going to make much progress because you're only shooting at 16% of the entire budget. This gives you in bar form some of the where the mandatory spending, the kind of automatic pilot, Medicare, Social Security, income security, and the two discretionary defense and non-defense. One of the challenges, of course, is Social Security, which up until a couple of years ago was bringing in more than it's paying. Because of the recession and because we have taken money out of the Social Security tax and had a tax cut on the payroll tax, we are now paying out a little more than we're bringing in. That payroll tax cut is supposed to expire, so it's a little less of a loss. But you can see that meeting that graph is going to be certainly a challenge. The other challenge is Medicare and Medicaid health care. Now, health care is growing greater than inflation. The Social Security, although that graph looked kind of ugly, as a percentage of GDP, it wasn't that bad. So as the gross domestic product grows, it's still a reasonable, achievable part of the budget, and as the GDP goes, revenue increases. So if we could kind of maintain at about 21% of GDP, we'd be pretty good, except for healthcare. Now, we can't solve Medicare and Medicaid as a government plan. If we're paying healthcare costs, you ask any corporation about their healthcare costs, and they'll say these costs are going out of control, much more than their revenues. And every company, they're trying to lay more expenses on their employees with co-pays and deductibles and all this other kind of stuff. It is a healthcare problem that obviously affects the federal government, but it affects everybody. And until we can get healthcare under control, you can never control the budget, and in fact, you can never control any kind of corporate budgets. We have traditionally blue being revenues, red being expenditures. We have generally taxed at about 18% of GDP and spent around 21% of GDP. And when people say it's just spending or it's just taxes, we've gotten into a situation where you're not going to get anywhere unless you do both. The spending is way out of control on the top, and the revenues are the lowest they've been in 50 years. So obviously we have to do something with both. But this shows that in the late 1990s, the blue line got above the red line. That was when the Clinton balanced the budget. We got revenues almost up to 21%, and expenditures a little over 18%. And we had a nice surplus, and we were doing well, and we, in 2001, cut taxes and increased spending. And you can see how it went out of control and just got worse. The budget deficit, when you put those two together, this shows the surplus we had in 2000 and at the end of 2000. We had a nice surplus going, and because of the tax cuts and the spending increases, we fell off the map, and that's down at the bottom of that chart is where we are now. The difference in administrations, when President Bush came in office at the end of the Clinton administration, because we'd gotten the budget under control, the 10-year projected surplus was $5.6 trillion surplus. When Obama came in, his 10-year projected budget showed an $8 trillion deficit. The 8 years of Bush, instead of the $5.6 trillion surplus, those 10 years came in at about a $3 or $4 trillion deficit, swing of about $1 trillion a year deterioration in the budget. As the debt as a percentage of GDP, this is the public debt. By 2010, we were projected from 2000 into 2000. We had projected we'd pay off the national debt by about 2008, 2009, 2010, somewhere in there, and would be running surpluses at the rate we were going for the next 50 years. 8 years later, the projection was that the public debt would obviously just go out of control. Now, one of the things that foreign held debt, this has public policy implications because our public debt, foreign held debt, China, Japan, Saudi Arabia hold most of it. We were paying off the debt held by the public, so it's going down towards zero, and now it's going out of control. And when foreign countries own this kind of level of debt, there's foreign policy implications, like China owning our debt. We're trying to do trade deals with China. They are in a much better bargaining position when they hold all of our paper. And so, and when Saudi Arabia lends us money, we can't argue too much about them selling what the price of oil is going to be. It has foreign policy implications. Now, when you're fiscally responsible, good things happen. Under the Clinton administration, the Dow Jones Industrial Average more than tripled. Under the Bush administration, it's worse at the end than it started. Under the Obama administration, it's come back a little bit, but almost is a little better than what it was significantly better than what it was when he took office. Also on jobs, the Clinton administration, 20 million jobs. Under the Bush administration, there was an increase in jobs, you just can't see it. We had the last year of the Bush administration was the collapse of the economy. When the blue lines represent the Obama administration. After a couple of months, the stimulus kicked in, and when they said the stimulus didn't work, I just show them the graph. You can make your own assessment whether it worked or not. The stimulus was in effect for a little over a year, and during that year we went from down in the dumps to doing well. The stimulus has run out, and so we're not doing so hot. One of the problems with this graph is that although we're gaining jobs, unless you're gaining about 150 to 200,000 jobs a month, you're not keeping up with the population. So if you have the numbers that we've had for the last couple of months, the unemployment rate is going to go up because more people are looking for jobs. Now, in terms of what to do about it, some say if you cut taxes, you'll increase revenues. Well, this chart, green is a year in which record individual income tax set a new record. Red is a year in which you did not set a new record. And you can see from 1961, whatever you did, you could raise taxes, you could lower taxes, you could have a recession, you could have a boom time, revenues always went up. Until the massive tax cuts after in 2001 and 2003, we went several years, unprecedented in 50 years, without reaching a new record. We finally reached a new record and then went right back in the dumps. So when people say, one, if you cut taxes, you increase revenues, first of all, they hadn't said anything, so whatever you do, revenues ought to go up. And two, when they did it, the massive tax cuts in 2001, 2003, they actually went down, which is, as you can see, virtually unprecedented in the last 50 years. And actually, if you go back to the 1920s, you'll only see a couple of years where as many as 2 years back to back, middle of the war, only a couple of times you had 2 years back to back. Never have you had a graph at the end as bad as this. And so 2001 and 2003, we cut taxes. This just shows a little bit of who got it. If you're a millionaire, you got an average over $100,000. You make between $200,000 and $1 million, you got about $7,000. If you make less than $50,000, you don't need ink to draw your bar. That's who got it. As I mentioned, the cost of 2 years of extending the tax cuts, the general fund is about $800 billion. The last bar on the right is the general fund budget of all 50 states. A couple of other things, the stimulus bill, about the same, Wall Street bailout, the TARP, a little less, healthcare reform, and 10 years spends about $900 billion. That was paid for, by the way, but gives you an idea of what a 2-year, $800 billion tax cut extension looks like compared to other expenditures. One of the suggestions is if you let all of the Bush tax cuts expire, where you would be, the light blue line is the budget without any of the tax cuts extended. The reddish is what extending the tax cuts would cost. The little green is what's called the doc fix. It's a little bit of Medicare physician reimbursement challenge we have. We're trying to keep up with inflation, and that's hard. The purple is interest on the national debt attributable to the increased deficit. But you can see the target for most deficit reduction plans is about $200 to $300 billion a year. They call that primary balance. There's a saying, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how'd you like to play? Other than interest on the national debt, the budget is in balance. The interest on the national debt is 3, 4, 5, 600, in out years, 5 or 600 billion dollars. So other than that, we're in balance. Really isn't saying much, but they call that primary balance, which gets you within shooting range of the budget getting under control. But you can see the difference in extending the tax cuts on the baseline balance budget and what would happen if they're extended. Now, there's some choices that we make along the way. You can let them expire and you don't have to do any of those cuts, Social Security, Medicare. And this chart just gives you an idea. You can have special education, or you can have tax cuts. You can have national health insurance, National Institute of Health budget over 10 years, and some of the other tax cuts that we compare. The first $1 trillion, those cuts and all those programs I mentioned, that was the first $1 trillion. To get into another $1.5 trillion, you got to go into Social Security and Medicare, and you're only, like I said, $2.5 trillion out of $4 trillion along the way. You aren't even back to even. So some of us have concluded that the only rational thing to do would be to let the tax cuts expire. If you want to extend some of them, fine. Cut a program and extend a tax. Raise somebody else's taxes, extend a tax cut. And that way you know the choices that you're making. In the Congressional Black Caucus budget, we extended all of the tax cuts up to $250,000. That is a $3 trillion extension. We paid for it by other things like treating investment income like ordinary income without a capital gains or dividend preference. Taxing the oil companies and adding a few, the so-called Buffett tax, and added them all up, and we got $300 billion, and we were able to extend all the tax cuts for the middle class, calling middle class up to 250. That's what they're calling in Washington. But we know the choices that we were making. One of the difficulties we've done is we've done things out of sequence. We cut the taxes, and now we're trying to cut the spending, and hoping the public doesn't notice that the spending cuts are necessitated because of the tax cuts. If we'd done them all at the same time, people could see the budget and see what was going on, and see the choices that are made. And that's what one of the things we're trying to do, to make sure that people know what choices are being made.